its axis, and I've spent my career working in tech, largely in engineering teams. Then I moved into product strategy and product management before running On Its Axis full time. And today I come to you with a product strategy hat. At On Its Axis, we work with a lot of organizations, helping them figure out how to compete in the market, how to enter new markets and innovate their product portfolios. So the topic of delighting customers and customer excellence is really important to the companies we work with. And one of my colleagues, Marianne Bianco, who's on the call today, and she's our expert speaker, we've partnered together on a project with a software solution that we leverage here at On Its Axis for assessing and leveraging your innovation talent. It's called Swarm Vision. And so I'd like to hand it over to Marianne to introduce herself and her background.
Thanks, Shelley. It's fun working with you. So yeah, as Shelley mentioned, I've got a background in customer management. Started my career in sales. I was 7 years at Siemens and partner alliances and 20 years at Oracle, and a variety of different functions like customer support, customer success, business development, but all roles that sort of focus on managing the customer in a sort of a post-sales type of organizational feed where you're driving revenue. I also have some experience as a chief customer officer at an AI startup company called Unifor, where I built out all the customer management functions for the organization. So that's a little bit about me. My background is mostly enterprise B2B and B2C.
Awesome. And I learn a lot every time we talk, Marianne, so I'm excited for today. I think we have to kick off the conversation today and acknowledge it's International Women's Day. We typically have a global audience, whether you're here right now or you're listening to the recording. So just take a moment. We want to celebrate and acknowledge women around the world for their achievements. This year's theme is Embrace Equity, and it's a reminder there's work to be done so we can create a more equal world for women. And that is all women. And Marianne, why don't you share this with us?
Yeah, so this is the theme of International Women's Day and Women's History Month. It's celebrating women who tell our stories. So I'm sure you'll see throughout LinkedIn today, you know, and through the whole month of March, this theme. And we may not have enough time today, but if for some reason we have a little bit of time at the end of the day or at the end of this presentation, because we have to log off right at 1, you know, I'd invite people to tell their stories, because we learn from one another by connecting with one another. And that's how we derive our inspiration. At least that's how I derive my inspiration. So Shelley and I wanted to make sure that we mentioned this as sort of a call out today.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, today's topic, so let's talk about what it means to delight customers. I want to share some statistics real quick. So recent Salesforce research suggests that 73% of customers expect brands to understand their unique needs and expectations. That research also says that roughly 39% of customers feel that the brands actually do this. And so we see a lot of gaps in terms of what companies are thinking about when they think of their customers and their needs versus what they're able to actually do for them. We're going to be throwing a lot of terms around today, but I think what's most important is that we're really thinking about the customer experience. And the truth is, we want elevated customer experiences, right? Each of us here on the call today, we're customers of things, goods, of services. And when we think about an elevated experience, what comes to mind? You know, something that delights you, which I think is really above and beyond sort of the status quo of I purchased this water bottle to drink my water, right? It has to do something extra. Maybe the company needs to do something extra so that I can have an elevated experience. So I'd love to have you post in the chat and share what you believe some companies out there today are doing, not only who they are, but what are they doing to delight customers. Maybe we'll learn some companies we haven't heard of that would be great to know about. So I'd love to hear some ideas. Zappos was my first over-the-top customer experience. Zappos, yes. And they made that sort of their tagline or mission. I think they told us that, and I think there were ways they showed us that. That's a great example.
Yeah, it is.
I'm going to share one, and then maybe folks will still be posting in the chat of one that I am loving right now, as I am. I did a dry January, which meant I didn't drink alcohol, and I gave up alcohol for Lent. And this company is Athletic Brewing. So if you've heard of them, you want to post in the chat, or if you've had any of their brews, their non-alcoholic brews, I'd love to know. But essentially, they delight in many different ways. I think what's really compelling to me is how they know their customers. They know their target market. And just yesterday, they unveiled the world's first, they're saying the world's first pre-workout brew. It's called Souped Up. It's coffee infused. And it's designed with, athletes, and their belief is, everybody's an athlete. Everybody who walks, who moves, who takes yoga, who does those half and full marathons and races is an athlete. So health and wellness, but still enjoying beverages. And if you get a chance, I'm just going to post this in the chat for another time. Watch the trailer for this fun souped up coffee experience. It's really cool, very innovative. All right, I will share one more example. I don't see any more in the chat. I'm going to share ClickUp. So ClickUp is something we use it on its axis to power our productivity. So, however, it can be extremely confusing to use or get onboarded because it does so many things. As you can see very clearly on their website landing page, one app to replace them all. And they do a lot of that really well, but it can be a lot to get onboarded. And so they've done two things really special to delight. ClickUp Consultants, they have a certification program for people in the productivity space to help their customers adopt and really be very efficient and effective using ClickUp. They also have a productivity conference every year called Level Up by ClickUp. And it helps you learn these productivity tools from experts, from internal teams, but also it creates community. So you can go to the event or you can watch the on-demand webinar and learn from others, collaborate with others. And so I think these are two themes here on Delight around empathy, listening, and community building that I think when we talk about new products and product strategy, we're always thinking about what kind of message do we want to leave? Who is our target audience and what's most important to them? And it takes a lot to figure that out. It doesn't happen overnight. Marianne's going to share with us more from an enterprise perspective based on all of her expertise, how customer-centric organizations, really more mature ones, are thinking about this and how they're doing this work. Marianne, how do they get started?
Thanks, Shelley. I love the ClickUp example. That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think, customer-centric management is something that a lot of companies will put in their mission statement, oh, we're customer-centric, and, it's a great goal. But to really, truly be customer-centric, there are a lot of tools and deliverables and actions that you have to do that to consciously be a customer-centric organization. And what sort of the theme today is taking those tools and using them to drive your growth objectives, because we can do all these tools, but if we don't like map them to what the growth objectives are, and I'm going to use that in the form of KPIs, key performance indicators, then we might have some wasted energy. So we go to the next slide. This is sort of an example. So customer management tools can be journey maps. You've heard that term. They can be a life cycle map. They can be an account plan. They can be a health check. They can be a QBR. There's all these things out there in organizations. They can be an NPS survey that all work towards understanding a 360-degree view of your customer. And KJ just said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. Yes, that's absolutely true. So these are examples of KPIs. Let's say in an organization, you want to increase your product adoption, and you obviously want to measure your product adoption. You want to increase brand loyalty, or you want to increase visibility, or you want to increase your retention or reduce your churn, or your client expansion and upsell. These are sort of some common KPIs that organizations look at. And these can be small SaaS startup companies. They can be, giant multi-billion-dollar corporations, but having this kind of conversation that goes on between lines of business to focus on a KPI is sort of a really sort of fundamental sort of step one of being a customer-centric organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about these tools today, and I'm actually even going to show a couple of examples. Customer journey maps are basically just design tools for crafting better engagement. It's very simple. You use them as a tool to understand the engagement with your clients. And why do we do this? We do this because we want to examine pain points. We want to look for opportunities for improvement. We want to align gaps to resources. This is one of my most famous, or one of my more popular ones, is doing sort of a gap analysis, because you may have all these, really great organizations and lines of business, working towards the same goal, but there might be gaps in the resources aligned to a particular function. And to actually find out what those gaps are, you use a journey map. So that's an example of using a design tool for crafting a better engagement. Another really common one is looking for best practices to document, and you can document those in the form of a PMO office, some sort of central function, which is also I'm super keen on. But if we kind of go back to just the fundamentals of customer journeys, if you go out and you kind of research it or Google it, there's anything, these are sort of the basic 4, but I've also seen 6 elements. But it's basically, what's your audience engagement? How do you, after you engage with your customer, how do you turn that engagement or that lead into a customer? And a customer is obviously a signed contract that generates revenue. How do you nurture the customers? Meaning, how do you take care of them? And then how do you fulfill the customer expectations? Because if you aren't nurturing them and you're not filling the customer expectations, you're likely not going to get the renewal. And that's going to be a direct hit to your growth objective. So this is a great diagram that talks about how we have physical touch points with our clients. That can be in the form of sales reps, BDRs, CSMs, anyone who touches the customer support person, a product person giving a demo, a pre-sales engagement person doing a demo. And it can also be digital touch points, obviously kind of reaching out and doing, marketing and outreach. But both of these digital touch points and physical touch points have a goal in common, which is advocacy of the client. So customer life cycle. Customer life cycle are tools that help you assess how your customers are experiencing your product. And once again, you know, this is another tool, right? Typically, these life cycle maps or engagement maps, and I'm going to show a couple examples, will focus on awareness of the product, engagement with your product, evaluation of your product, how the customer purchases your product, what your customers' experience is with customer support with the product, and then what their experience is in terms of just measuring satisfaction, advocacy, and retention.
Gary, and I have a question for you on this one, if that's okay. And please, if you have questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. And if we'll get them now, or we'll make sure we address them later, so you don't forget, just post them, that's fine. My question is, do you find in your experience that most companies do better in one of these areas, or is one especially challenging in today's market?
Yeah, I think it depends on the size of the company. You know, I think in early stage startups that there's sort of a focus and preoccupation with just, a very, very quick kind of analysis on retention and churn, and because it's all very, fast-paced, kind of revenue oriented. So I would say that, sort of a life cycle map is probably a little bit more common in an early stage. And I think the customer journey maps are probably a little bit more common because there's a little bit more robust in terms of long-term engagement, where you're really kind of looking at, there's so many different touch points. But it's a good question.
Thank you.
I have to turn my phone off. So what's the purpose of mapping a customer life cycle from the internal stakeholders' point of view? So an internal stakeholder are people in the company. So, all the way from the CEO to the CMO to the CPO to customer success people to the chief financial officer, all these kind of internal stakeholders that I think it's super important to have a customer life cycle so that everybody can take a look at what the points of value are, the points of opportunity. But typically you're going to start with some priorities, right? Because, taking a look at all those 6 stages that we had is a pretty monumental task. So what I thought for the purposes of today's kind of conversation here is that we would focus on 3 KPIs as sort of a priority area that are kind of more common, right? So, and these are common whatever stage the company is, whether it's startup, mid-stage, or kind of big legacy customers. So one of the problems that we're always trying to solve is scale and efficiency. And the reason we're trying to solve scale and efficiency is because that's the biggest improvement for any kind of hyper growth. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. Increasing retention of your clients, because the cost to acquire a client is 10 times more than the cost to retain a client. So you want to get your client and you want to retain them through the form of a renewal. And then you want to maximize that retention through client upsell and client expansion. So these are 3 that I selected that are kind of what I think kind of common, if you will. So we'll go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about how to leverage this. So what you want to do is you want to diagram out the life cycle that relates to those KPIs. And I'm going to go through that in a second. And super, super critical is communicating the life cycle relentlessly to the internal stakeholders. So once you kind of diagram out what it is you're trying to solve, you want to have that up front and center in front of all the lines of business who are going to be taking part in that exercise. Because as you probably all know, as we all know, communication is key to any kind of repeatability, right? I think there's a statistic out there that you have to hear something 4 times before it like sits in your head. Well, put that into a complex business environment where you're in a fast-paced startup and people are kind of moving in all sorts of different directions. So if you're the leader of customer success, you want to make sure that when you get this life cycle map created, you get buy-in from your stakeholders, and then you're communicating it, very vigorously. And then
I have a question, Marianne. How do you start? Like, diagram the life cycle. Is a typical customer success person with that role equipped for that, or who do they need to collaborate with to begin that process?
Yeah, Shelley, that's a good question. I think it's the leadership team that needs to craft it. And so that, because there's buy-in from different organizations to craft it. And you can use tools like Rasky charts that once you craft it, you can say, okay, these people are responsible for certain tasks. I'm going to just show a super simple one, but usually comes from someone who is a leader, in sort of a management role, so that they can, have the autonomy and the effectiveness to roll it out.
Right.
So this last point's also super important about measuring the outcomes. And I think KJ had mentioned that, you have to be able to measure it to show any kind of improvement. So when you're creating a customer life cycle or a customer journey map, you want to create the metrics around it, and you want to have agreement on those. And in a large organization, if you have a RevOps organization, revenue operations organization, the leader can partner with the revenue ops organization so that you have common metrics. For example, there's net retention and there's gross retention. And sometimes companies will use gross retention because it's a little bit more forgiving than net retention. But that's just an example. You might want to measure both, but you want to make sure you're in agreement with the people who are in revenue ops and finance for those metrics, and you want to drive really, really home. One of the things that we did at Oracle that I was super fond of is that we did every single Friday, I think we did it at noon, we did a biz ops call, and we brought all the people from the customer success organization together, and we reviewed a different metric every Friday. And everybody knew, all the CS leaders, and knew what metric was going to be reviewed for their territory on that Friday. So everybody came already knowing what was going to be measured and how they had to report out on it. But that's an example of just super driving home an initiative so that the organization aligns to the measurement. Makes sense?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, so feel free to ask questions. But what I wanted to do here was use an example of a life cycle model that focuses on those KPIs that I've talked about, which was scale and efficiency, retention of the client, and then expansion and upsell. So this looks super simple. I know this looks super simple, and you can go out on Google, and there's so many super complex life cycle engagements. But these are critical for repeatability and for scaling. So scale and efficiency occur when the model is optimized and when it's measured. So all 4 of these quadrants have to be measured and optimized so that it just happens really, really well within an organization. So if you take the first one, which is the implementation, like right now out there's applications that take a year to implement, super complex ones. There's also applications out there that can be implemented in a day, or that use low code and or AI based and are super easy to implement. But it has to get implemented with success. And then the next thing is deploy and adopt. So the organization has to deploy the application so that the customers are using it, and there has to be sort of an adoption, because you think about it, you could deploy an application, but then if the customer doesn't use it or they don't adopt it, they're never going to renew it, right? So this is where this whole concept of business transformation and digital transformation come in terms of the adoption and all the transformation that has to come forward in an organization when you're adopting a new application, a new tool, a new module, or whatever. So the deploy and adopt is super critical. In large organizations, there's usually many people who are touching the client during this phase. And the third one is optimize and maintain. So the application is deployed, it's adopted, the business transformation is going through, you're looking at metrics on how the application's adopted, and then optimize and maintain is for looking for improvements for efficiencies. This can be done through a customer success organization as well. And then finally, renewing and upselling. So focusing on renewing the contract and looking for ways for the application to gain improvement through some kind of an upsell movement. And it's super important throughout this whole process that the repeatability is the key, right? Because you want all these things to happen really, really carefully and kind of without a whole lot of thought. So the next step, this is an engagement model, it's high level, but the next step, what you do in building this out is to actually take each of these quadrants and map who's doing what in the company to ensure success in each of these 4 quadrants. And once again, these quadrants could change depending on what your KPIs are. But that's where you kind of drive down to the next level. So am I like completely boring everybody?
This is great. I don't see any feedback in the chat, but I'm learning a lot. Yes, we have a note from KJ. Thank you for engaging with us. Yes, in my opinion, never easy. Aligning cross-functional teams is an art form. Starts internally.
True. It's so true. And, honestly, because of COVID and work from home, engaging cross LOB is even more difficult because you have to really, I think it's easier to engage when you know people and you can just say, hey, talk about this. Can we put a best practice? I see a gap here. Can we put together some kind of an initiative here to close this gap, right? So now we, try to make opportunities to do that, on video, and person is actually even better. But
I imagine there's a lot of customer segmentation and prioritization you have to do in this process, because there's probably, depending on the company, depending on what it sells, there's customers who need your product or service, and then there's customers who want it, and then getting to that level of delight with this optimal experience. I imagine you don't look at every customer sort of the same when you do this work.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, every customer, every organization is different. Every touch point is different. And that's the beauty of these tools. So I think I have another example on the next slide, Shelley, that I wanted to quickly go over. And I actually invited the person who created this slide to join, but I don't see if he's on the participant list. So I wanted to give him credit for it. He's not here, but we created this together in one of our roles. This is an example of a customer success / customer life cycle broken down into of movements, right? So this is just an example. Okay, this is, again, there's no right or wrong. There's no like, oh, this is the map. Everything has to be created completely for your environment. Once again, what you're trying to accomplish. But the first stage is onboarding the account. This is an example, right? Onboarding the customer. You want to build the account plan, because in the account plan, it's gonna spell out everything you know about that client. You want to track process You want to track usage of the application. And you want to likely have dashboards for the CSMs in the organization on what they're going to be tracking. There's a lot of great tools out there right now on dashboards and applications. There's Gainsight, there's Tatango, there's many applications out there. When I was at Oracle, we used our own internal tools, but they all, kind of, perform the same function, which is to track and measure. So this is an example of what would be a motion that you would want to perform on a monthly basis, or customer status meetings, progress checks and check-ins, quarterly business reviews are a really big, important way to measure success. This is with the client. You want to do a QBR with the client. And you want to say, okay, how are we doing on, this tracking to this measurement? Semi-annual executive checkpoint, annually taking a look at the annual account review, mapping that to the goals that you set, and of course, closing the renewal. And then here I have to kind of move my little screen here, renewal alerts. This is just a draft status. Many organizations, maybe like on a 24-month renewal, would want to do an alert 9 months before. So again, this is just kind of an example.
It's great. We had some notes in the chat.
Okay.
Amanda was sharing, had a lot of turnover since March 2020 due to COVID. Alignment and connection to the mission all feed into customer delight and experience in human-dependent interactions. I think you're saying too that internal communication is so important, that internal stakeholder alignment is so important. And then doing this work and documenting it so that if you have turnover, someone can pick it up and nurture those customers, and that customer experience stays intact.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. So that's a whole new paradigm to measure and to work towards, is the loss of data through high attrition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's why there's applications and there's tools out there that CSMs can use to track all the engagement with their clients, so that's there. And if that person happened to leave or there's transition, that data is there, so that you don't leave the client hanging in terms of having to start all over again, right? Like, oh, well, what was that person talking about, and so forth.
One thing I see in the field, Marianne, is that many times an organization may not have a customer success department per se, or there isn't a tie-in between product, customer success, and sales for this to happen so beautifully, as you've illustrated. And so what are some recommendations that you'd have for companies that maybe don't have this function to get started?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Shelley. I mean, I think it's a really good question. So it's really important to just, there's no kind of right process, wrong process. It's really just starting somewhere, putting a stake in the ground, and getting buy-in from the other leaders who are touching the client, touching your customers. And then it's, once you build the model that you want to work towards, let's say this is the model you want to work towards, okay? Then you have to communicate it relentlessly to all the people who are going to be touching this. And you have to communicate it. You have to drive acknowledgement of it. And many times a tool like a Rasky chart is super helpful, because it'll then show who's on first and who's responsible. So for example, in really, really large organizations, on this close renewal annual, there are renewal reps as opposed to CSM. Some organizations, the CSM also drives the renewal. But And, sometimes the CSM and the renewal rep are working super closely together. Sometimes it's both one of the same person, but it's important that they each know what they're doing and when they're doing it, right? And so they're working kind of in concerts. That's an example of driving the communication so that it's, really, really ingrained into the organization. Another example would be a quarterly business review. So let's say you're doing a quarterly business review with a large enterprise client, which is mostly my background, and they want to see product roadmaps, right? Because it's really important for them in kind of understanding what the product roadmap is. Then you're going to want to, if you're a CSM or you're a salesperson, you want to bring in somebody from the product organization, likely to do a product presentation at the QBR. So this is an example of engaging another organization so that you are really, really focused on what the customer wants. The customer wants to understand the roadmap. And if they want to understand the roadmap, that's actually a really good sign, because that means they're investing in the product and they're probably going to renew, right? So those are two examples I can think of, Shelley.
Thank you. Yeah, I think of that as a champion, a customer champion. And especially when software allows us to sort of crowdsource our ideas and it gets voted on, and then we hear back that our feature might be, implemented at some point, right? And I feel so heard. And that's such a kind of an easy-ish way for companies to innovate, is by using their customers and their customer champions to help guide them into what's next, right? Because we're using the product, day in and day out. Again, what sounds easy is probably very challenging to do in practice, right? It takes a lot of effort to build something like this, or to do the research to understand how our customers are thinking and what they desire.
Yeah, absolutely. And it takes a lot of focus, and it takes practice and patience, and it can change. You might have a process that you have in place for 8 months and then realize that, there's some best practices that you need to put in, and part of the process gets tweaked and you want to add another element. So that's all goodness, right? Because you're focusing on the process, you're focusing on the best practice, you're aligning it to what the key performance indicator is, and then you're tweaking it through your measurement.
Awesome.
Okay, I think what I wanted to say here is that there's really no right or wrong to the process. So as I've mentioned, you can start small. You can start with just kind of having a discussion around what the KPIs are that you want to drive towards. You can bring in finance, you can bring in marketing, you can bring in sales, and agree on what those KPI metrics are. In a larger organization, if you join and let's say you're in a customer success organization or you're in sales, KPIs are probably going to be pretty clear on what you're going to be driving towards. It's once you have that, you start to build a map that shows the touch points and shows the life cycle that you want to create for repeatability. You drive it home, you repeat it, and you measure it as you go along. So that would be my key advice.
Thank you. Thank you for all that wealth of information for us today. And
you're welcome. Do we have any questions?
Feel free to come off mic and ask questions or post in the chat. One thing that we'll share in a couple of moments is a survey. So if there's something that you thought of today around this topic or any topic around business bites and our focus, let us know in the survey and we'll consider it for a future event.
Sounds good.
All right.
Right. That's it. We do have a couple minutes. I guess I talked fast. That's kind of not terribly unusual for me. I think it comes from being from New York, but do we have anybody who wants to share their customer story for National Women's Day? Okay, we have a shy audience. No worries.